the end. And Michael, good afternoon to you. You're in London.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So it's about 4 o'clock there.
Yes, it is. It's right in the middle of the afternoon.
Yeah. So first question I have is, what is that amazing image behind you?
It's a painting by British-Italian artist Enrico David. He's a very dear friend, and it's a beautiful painting. He's the artist that represented Italy in the Venice Biennale last year.
Oh, okay, great. Well, it's good to have Italy already on our minds because we'll be visiting there virtually a few times during the course of our talk. Michael, if you don't mind, because we have so much to look at, I'm going to go ahead and start the PowerPoint right away.
Sure.
And partly the reason I wanted to do that is because the first images actually give us a wonderful handle on the beginning of your story, because you're from Cyprus. And I'm not sure how many people in the audience will have visited Cyprus or know it well, but this is a series of views of an installation that you did at the museum in Nicosia, NEMAC, the Nicosia Municipal Arts Center. And I think it just gives us a great way to start talking about your background, really, and also your philosophy about the work. I can imagine that growing up in Cyprus, you might not have had a lot of access to what we might consider a professional design scene, but you would have presumably been saturated in a very deep cultural milieu with very, very ancient roots indeed. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what its effect on you has been.
No, absolutely. I mean, you spotted it right. Growing up in a very small place like an island, the Mediterranean, of course, there's an amazingly rich history. But, you know, as a creative, you always try to look for inspiration in different ways. There's been quite a lot of influences. Of course, some key figures while I was growing up, some artists, some important architects that I tried to link and get inspiration from. At the same time, obviously, the incredibly beautiful historical artifacts that you find in museums. So it was interesting to do an exhibition of this scale starting from Cyprus. So it's a little bit of going back. I've been living in the UK for almost 35 years. Where I made my career as a designer. I left Cyprus to come to the UK to study civil engineering. So I never really had a clear direction as to what I wanted to end up being. So it was interesting to go back there at NEMAC, beautiful space, and got invited to do an exhibition of a large scale looking at 10 years of the last 10 years of my work, really.
And these objects that we're looking at are a kind of personal biography in another sense, because you've been collecting them for such a long time.
Yeah, this is from my own personal collection of stones that I've been collecting ever since I was a teenager. Most of them are picked up by myself from various trips. They're not from, they're from multiple locations. A lot of them are from Cyprus, quite a few of them are from Greece. And I've been carrying them back to the UK. So they're very, very precious to me. And it was a great opportunity because for an exhibition of that nature to showcase that collection of stones, because it's been a great reference for my work, and this is I find it incredibly inspiring to look at.
We should say that the name of the exhibition was Things That Go Together, which seems like a very primary baseline for thinking about design. But I really love the way that you're using simple adjacency and juxtaposition here to create meaning. It reminds me a little bit of the beautiful installations at Kettle's Yard, the great museum in Cambridge, which also has these wonderful installations of pebbles. But I wonder whether you might talk about, actually, let me stick on that image for a second. I wonder whether you might talk about the way that the act of arrangement and orchestration of space serves as a kind of connective tissue across the many different sorts of design that you create.
Well, it was an interesting moment because all of a sudden it was a moment where I had to look back at the work that I had been producing all those years. And it seemed to be a great mixture in terms of its extremity of the type of design work, starting with my own brand, which I established in 2007, primarily focusing on lighting, producing some limited edition pieces, and then later on extending in the great collaborations with known historical brands like Floss, and then some furniture brands that follow. So suddenly putting all that work together in one space, it was a real struggle for me. Is how do you actually categorize? How do you actually display that in a way that it has a meaning and it also has to make sense? So we started approaching the exhibition chronologically at the beginning, trying to kind of design a whole series of plinths that would establish some hierarchy, but right until probably a few months before the exhibition, I decided to scrap all these ideas, and I said, you know what, I just don't need all that planning. I just simply display all that work on the floor, on this beautiful old marble floor of the museum. So there's no hierarchy. There is no specific route that I expected the visitor to follow. So everybody was free to approach the object quite closely and simply choose their own path through the exhibition. And it was amazing, because that was exactly the moment when I realized that everything worked together in that space, in one space, and everything had a value, and probably an equal value, from expensive one-off pieces to production pieces that to a piece of found stone that I had, and it made complete sense to me. So somehow also the title, which I decided before the exhibition, was quite appropriate with that to that gesture.
I wanted to ask you about another thing that is perhaps pertinent to Cyprus as a location, which is that you've often said that your feeling is that the fundamental nature of creativity has really not changed over the course of human civilization, and that even thinking about that extraordinary archaic culture that was present in your homeland, that you feel connected to it, not just because of geography, but because you're basically doing the same thing they were. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the rootedness of the practice and the way that you think about working in something as modern and technological as lighting, in light of that very deep sense of creativity as a continuum.
Of course, I always use that example of that documentary by Herzog that he did, which is called The Cave of the Forgotten Dreams. And it's looking at this 10 million years of caves, so that and he looks at the cave paintings and getting close to them. I mean, later on they decided to close that cave down, but what was amazing about it is to understand that nothing has really changed. Creativity hasn't really changed over that span of time, was such a great span of time. So it's interesting to look at design and really address or acknowledge the fact that nothing is really new, that everything seems to get repeated over and over again. So once you acknowledge that point as your starting point, then I think what you're trying to achieve is something much more meaningful than that. So you're not sort of constantly struggle to innovate, to change, to present something new, to shock, or to do anything, but really understand what are the values that makes an object first relevant to the day that we're living, and then a second is to acquire an exceptional quality that can last for a long period of time. So so this is my link to what you commented before.
One of the fascinating details of your biography, Michael, is that when you were struggling to establish yourself as a designer without a lot of income from your design work yet, you actually made your income as a yoga teacher. And I found that fascinating to learn, partly because, and here we're starting to look at the work from your own brand, the Michael Anastassiades brand. This is a series called Mobile Chandeliers. And we can see here the incredible calibration, what I almost want to call the Vitruvian mathematical quality of the line, the use of pure forms like circles, the proportionality, the harmony. But it seems to me like there's something that this has in common, perhaps with ideas associated with yoga and ideas of rigor, discipline, calibration, control, but all leading to a kind of stillness and meaning. And I wonder if you might talk about that idea of the object as imbuing a kind of disciplinarity or care.
Absolutely. I discovered yoga right after I graduated in design in 1994. I was looking for something different to do. I was very curious about it. I accidentally landed in a place where there was this a yoga class, an Ashtanga class, to be more specific. And then since that day, I became completely hooked. And it was an interesting moment because it was right the start of my design studio in 1994, right after graduating in 1993. So it's kind of a learning curve in many ways, two learning curves starting simultaneously. One, my really own personal design education, which I had to pursue through my own experience in discovering what design needed to be. And then second, my journey through yoga and learning so much and realizing that there's so much more to acquire from that. So those things have always worked in parallel, and especially during the first years of my career that I used as I call my research years in design. I did a lot of experimental work, as they label it now, sort of critical design. In many ways, I did quite a lot of collaborative work with some great designers like Dan and Raby, which were very well received, and it had a great audience. But there was, one at some point in my career, I also realized that what I was missing was really my connection to industry, and I really started questioning my role as an industrial designer. Obviously, going back to your observation about the mobile chandeliers and the notion of balance, all these different observations and the link to yoga, I think it's subconscious, the link. I don't think it's a conscious link, of course. I mean, like everything, I believe that you do somehow comes out in your work. I think there's a little bit of my civil engineering background probably in there, because it was quite challenging. It's a really challenging project. But certainly yoga has influenced my work, and I still practice to this day. I reconnected with my practice since the lockdown, which is a great thing to have back.
Yeah, it's been a terrible time in history, but a great time for yoga. Sourdough bread, these things that we're embracing to keep ourselves sane. It might be worth underlining that shift that you just described from a more speculative design practice. I've put in mind, for example, of something I read about one of your, I think, MA works from the Royal College of Art, which was a light that would only turn on when there was only one person present. So it was a kind of light to accompany solitude, for example.
It was my first ever light that I produced, and it was during this period that I was explaining before. My brand was called the antisocial light, and it's a light that glows only when there is absolute silence. So you have to respect that peculiar behavior of the light in order to receive its glow. So you have to be completely silent. Otherwise, if you start talking around the light starts to dim down and then eventually switch off. At the same time, I also did another lamp, which was it looked exactly the same, but had exactly the opposite function. It was called the social light. So you need to talk to it to keep it going. Otherwise, if you stop talking to it, then the light dies out and then eventually switches off. I called it more like the first therapy object that I labeled it, and suddenly, it was exploring our relationship with electronic products, or electronic, I would say, because it was quite an interactive piece rather than just a lamp that gives you, that offers you its glow, but it becomes more like a companion that you talk your frustrations to. So it was interesting because, I've always been attracted to light. Obviously, what you see here in the picture is my first really commercial chandelier as part of the Michael Anastassiades brand. It was something I designed for my own home. A lot of my pieces that first started appearing in my brand were designed for my own space.
Oh, interesting. The resonance of those early projects, the social and antisocial lights, they seem to have a totally different meaning now because of the lockdown. But it's also interesting to know that there was a kind of personal origin for these, what turned out to be very commercially facing projects. And of course, the other shift there is that you had to learn about production, I suppose, and actually getting involved in a small scale, high quality manufacturing business, as well as learning the trade of being a designer.
Absolutely. I mean, this urge that I felt of getting into industrial production, and the fact also that the entry to that world of brands and being somehow invited to participate in that scene was almost an impossibility, and especially with the work that I had developed before, all this experimental critical design. Suddenly asking brands to trust me in the design of normal everyday products, it was not going to happen. So I felt that establishing my own brand first would enable me to have all the freedom I wanted in realizing things exactly in the same way and closest to my own personal vision. And then secondly, the fact that, I was able to make things happen rather than having to rely on other manufacturers to get things done. So, and it was an incredible journey. I mean, it was yet another knowledge that I had to acquire. I started looking at different small family-run workshops. I traveled quite extensively to locate them, and then presented a small collection of lighting, primarily lighting products, which I showcased, and then started trading after that.
Was it very difficult to, and here I'll just move to a couple of more recent pieces. This one is called Vertigo, and this one has the wonderful title of Primitive Structure. But I wonder whether the quality control was a big challenge for you, and whether that was part of why you had to go on this global search for artisanal support for your vision.
Well, all these pieces were primarily focused on material making and craftsmanship, and they were fundamental things that I wanted to focus on. I mean, I studied different models that existed in history, the role of the designer and the role of the designer maker. I mean, if you look at the great Austrian school, of architects that produced all these beautiful furniture and lighting products, and the Wiener Werkstätte, making, and it was so linked to making that seemed to be absent in my generation of designers in that extent. I think now there is a little bit, it's more a model that exists more widely, but back then when I started, there was not that much reference in that. I mean, you would either be a craftsperson specializing in a certain craft, but the idea of having a wider approach in terms of material, technology, and the language was quite an interesting challenge to take on. So, but I learned a lot. I learned a great deal, and it was amazing. It was I learned more than I ever learned even when I was studying design, because I really never had a direct link in the making myself and understanding materials and appreciate. I knew what I liked and I knew what I wanted my designs to be.
I'm particularly interested in this question of the conversation with the artisans that you're describing. It sounds to me like what you're saying is that you bring to the conversation a kind of breadth and maybe a set of abstract principles of visual language. And so that's the sort of horizontality of the project, and that the artisan brings depth and a kind of vertical entrenchment in a specific discipline and knowledge of materials and tools and the trade. Does that sound like a fair description of the conversation, or does it become more complicated than that in practice?
No, completely. I mean, I call myself a reductionist. I like to remove as much as I possibly can from the visual destruction of the product. I remove layers and layers of information. And what I decide to maintain in terms of my visual language is something really pure. I mean, beyond that point, there's nothing else really that you can take out from the product, because the product stops existing after that point. So what remains and you can work with is really those qualities that you described that can be inserted by the maker, by the craftsman, by the material choice, and also how you work with that material and the perfection that these pieces are put together. Because as we all know, the biggest challenge is to make the simplest forms in design. And if you look at the mobile chandeliers, which you highlighted earlier, these pieces are incredibly complex in terms of their engineering, for as simple as they look. Because what I wanted to explore behind them is also this gesture that you have all this series of independent rods that somehow, by screwing them together, they light up. So there's about 100 different components in every single mobile chandelier. So they're micro components. So every piece has every arm has probably, if you consider that there's probably like 4 arms in the piece. So you can imagine 100 components between 4 arms. So there's quite a lot of things there that you don't see. And it's important to have that experience, I think, with a product, even if you have something just simply hanging above your table or in your foyer, and being in perfect balance. The idea that these structures can almost move with the wind. You just tap them and then suddenly they get out of balance, and then they slowly find themselves back in balance. So all these experiences, I think, were really, really important and are so directly linked to the craftsmanship in the material and the way that these things are put together.
I love this picture we're looking at, which is not showing the mobile chandeliers, of course, but the more recent Vertigo, but because it suggests a kind of communal spirit with the Axel Salto ceramic and the furniture by Dansk Möbelkunst. So that a sense of these exemplary objects that contain within them that kind of complexity that you're describing, and yet have also a sort of intuitive simplicity and almost self-evidentness, which of course on inspection is anything but self-evident, but that sense of resolution that you're describing. Let's close out this moment of looking at your own products by looking at a few mirrors that you've made. So it's important to say that you're not only a lighting designer, although it's interesting maybe to get into that by looking at mirrors, because it's another way of addressing light, not through direct.
Exactly, you spotted it exactly right. I mean, I see mirrors not as a surface of just simple reflection of things of yourself, as vanity objects, but more as a reflection of light and its relationship to space. So for me, that's the main attraction to mirrors. And it has been, and as you can see, a lot of them explore the notion of light through unexpected materials like, copper polished surfaces that, change also and tarnish with time, and it's a live object, it's something that you live with that changes constantly, and then you repolish it, and then suddenly the glow, the reflection of light is completely different. This particular one is in glass and is part of the 4-phase mirror project that I did originally, conceived as an exhibition for the MAC in Vienna for Guy Müller-Schlosser. Was time and again was the exhibition back in 2013. But I love, that the idea of how light, and especially how light reflects in odd places. In this case, the transition between the floor and the wall. You can position these reflective objects in any orientation or height in your room on this junction between surfaces, which is fascinating.
It's perhaps worth mentioning the title of this is Waxing Gibbous. So as you say, it's one of several phases referring to the passage of the moon and its phases in the sky. And I guess, Michael, one thing that that this image maybe helps us get into is the relationship between design and sculpture. And maybe if I just go to this next image, which is a really great one to hold on to as we talk about this. This is the Fontana Amorosa lighting system. I just want to cite something that Mark Benda actually mentioned to me this morning as we were talking about your work. And he said, you had said something to him that really stuck with him, which is that there's a big difference between making a sculpture and putting a light bulb in it and making actual lighting. And it might even be hard to say exactly what that difference is, but it seems very clear that you're dealing with lighting in its fullness and as a genre of creativity. And I wonder whether you might talk about that a little bit more. So what does it mean to make actual lighting rather than just a curious sculptural object that happens to illuminate?
I never, I never saw light as purely like a functional object, and for me, function, of course, is a very big part of it. The quality of the light is a very big part of it. I always say that when I design a light, I always start from the glow. I always start from the source, and that is really fundamental. But that has extended all throughout my all the lights that I've ever designed, including the industrial pieces, even the industrial production pieces for Floss. In this particular case, the Fontana Amorosa pieces are quite special in the sense that it's a celebration of light. In many ways, these objects are very, very free. They find themselves in the form of water fountains. And they're reminiscent to a lot of different things. I think everybody can read into this object in their own way. What's unique about them, and especially if you look at the object on the right, is suddenly you have the light actually resting on the metal structure, and the light fixture resting on the source of light. And this is amazing, the fact that you have the metal structure actually balancing on top of the glass spheres, and the idea that you have the light right at the bottom of the light picture, which is not something that is very common in that way. But there's quite a lot of different iterations, and this is just two of them for this particular collection. But these probably, I would say, are the most expressive of the pieces that I have ever done in terms of lighting. You could say sculpturally expressive in that way. But
yeah, I think they're among the greatest masterpieces of recent years, really, in any design genre. So it's really worth underlining them. I did want to also mention another thing about them, which is that, of course, they have a very powerful story behind them. So the Fontana Amorosa, as I understand it, is where the goddess Venus would go to rejuvenate herself. And so there's an idea here about sexuality, fecundity, femininity, as you know, that goddess represents, and also water, as you said. But also,
it is, and there's a strong link, you know, to this the idea that this mythical place of where Venus would go and drink the water of the eternal love and youth is actually in Paphos in Cyprus. It's a specific it's a specific location. So you know, I saw these pieces as a celebration of love and water, of course, which I'm particularly fascinated by. So there was an interesting story behind them, but I like this idea that they're drinking fountains rather than actually baths where Aphrodite or Venus would go and drink the water from.
it's also interesting, though, that they could be analogized to the fluted columns that you actually used in the tabletop installations, and of course are such a common representative object of classicism, and particularly the object on the right, it almost seems like a negative image of a column in some way. So there's also a good example here of how you're drawing back on these historically distant sources and making them new in the present.
Yes, it's definitely a classical configuration there, and rightly so. You made the right observation. In a way, it's almost like, let's say, the linear drawing of a column, sort of, and how you draw the flutes, but just simply vertical lines that are perfectly parallel.
Yeah.
For the tubes.
So with your forgiveness, I'm now going to speed up a little bit because we have a lot of projects to look at, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to see them all. So here we have an absolutely spectacular image of the Lit Lines collection. What is the venue here, by the way, Michael?
It is Palazzo Durini in Milan, on Via Durini. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's not a museum, it's a commercial space that usually is, I think, at that time, it belonged to was rented by this luxury handbag or leather goods brand, and this space was taken over by Nilufar Gallery. You know, I got the nicest room. It was probably my debut collection for Nilufar. Something very different than what she normally does. And it was an interesting collection for me because it was very much inspired, because at that time, in that period, I was traveling quite extensively to India. And interestingly, you would walk around the city, and then all you would see is these fluorescent bulbs that are tied loosely on trees or on very kind of crude structures. And then suddenly at night, all those casings would disappear, and the only thing that remains is just the glow of the light. So you read these lines in all sorts of different angles and configurations by just simply moving into the landscape. And I just thought that that was quite a magical image to capture. So I think this particular collection is inspired from that. I mean, you might argue and say it's quite reminiscent to the tube chandelier which you showed earlier, but it's a much more playful collection in looking at this configuration of always three bulbs most of the times.
Playful yet geometric at the same time. Yeah. And then this, as I understand it, is another Nilüfer gallery project with related forms.
Yes, this is the one well-known sequence. The space itself is actually my current studio in Camden. Before it was converted into what it is now. It used to be a car mechanic garage, which I acquired about 4 years ago. It hadn't been touched for 40 years probably, and it was used as a car mechanic garage. And I decided to have this exhibition and produce new work just to mark that time before the renovation. And it was interesting because it was using the bulb as a unit of measure, because these particular bulbs come in 1 meter and half a meter. So the idea of using them mostly in the vertical or horizontal configuration was more about measuring the space and the idea that I was going to inhabit that space. So, and you can see all the different iterations are, it's a play between the 1 meter and the half a meter bulb, which sit alongside with an equal diameter brass rod. So all these different configurations together in one space.
It's also great to go from the historic background to this car mechanic garage, and then we have these extraordinary images of the pendulum light in one of the historic rooms at the V&A, and then another installation at the V&A here. So again, showing the way that light reconditions space and can also be transported into different spaces and sort of hold its own, but also have a communication with the surroundings.
Well, I like the contrast, and especially in these particular spaces, the Victoria and Albert Museum, as well as in Palazzo Durini, and the contrast between all these kind of quite ornate environments and having this very simple, I would say, very minimal accents, and especially in light. So the actual physicality is more a gesture there. This particular one is called Ama, and it's a tribute to the pearl divers, the Japanese pearl divers. So in the form of a giant necklace on the floor. So it was interesting also technologically. I mean, it was a collaboration at that time with Floss that we made a one-off piece that we exhibited during the London Design Festival.
And really, it speaks well to the Robert Adam ceiling above it, doesn't it?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
It speaks beautifully to the Robert Adam ceiling above it.
Yeah,
two different ways of thinking. Classical proportion, that's for sure. Let's look for a moment at some, again, non-lighting projects, starting with this one, which is called Halfway Round, very appropriate title, which is for the aforementioned Dansk Mobilkunst, in this beautiful Oregon pine, very sort of plain material that also says a lot when you let it speak. And I wanted to ask you, Michael, if you could talk a little bit about the way that furniture conditions a space differently from lighting. So what's the difference when you start working with solid non-illuminated forms like furniture, and how much of it carries across from your lighting work?
What makes a lighting unique object is the fact that it has two different lives and two different scenarios that it actually exists in. I mean, most of the time, 80% of the time when you see a light, it's actually off, and 20% of its light, it's on. So these two different scenarios, very, very distinct. They're very, very different, because from the moment you turn a light on, it stops being just simply a sculptural object. And it acquires also a completely different dimension, because the actual glow of the light, the way that it interacts with its own physical form of the chandelier or the structure that supports it, its interaction to the space around it, to other objects around it, is unique in that way. And I think this is something that you don't actually experience in furniture. I mean, you can occupy a piece of furniture and the experience becomes different than simply looking at it. but light is unique, I think, in its kind in that way. And that's the difference that I see between furniture. I started in lighting. I mean, I had a passion in lighting. I ended up working extensively with light, but it was just also a coincidence because I started and focused with my own brand on lighting because it was very, very difficult and complicated to manage everything on my own at that time. So decided to put a focus on that. And then later on, Floss came in and invited me and said, we want to work with you. So, you know, all of a sudden, I sort of dived into this quite extensive sort of partnership with them and developed even more lights. And I think when the opportunity came to work with furniture, I was super excited to dive into it because I had produced furniture for my own use, for my own house, but I never really went to the extent of manufacturing it or doing it for other people.
You know, I want to hear much more about Floss, and maybe I'll just jump ahead to that, but I did want to show these amazing images of your work with stone, Italian stone companies.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the miracle chips that people may have seen. This got a lot of attention because of its sheer amazingness and almost impossible quality, very appropriately titled. And these were produced with Amro, the great stone quarry company from Monte Altissimo. And then also some stone furniture here from Salvatore. And this amazing, this is called The End of the Affair. Which is
The End of the Affair. And it's a series of three volcanoes. This is actually Vesuvio. They're more abstract objects. Originally, I designed these objects to be placed on the tables that you saw right before the Love Me, Love Me Not series. But when I made them, and then I realized that they wouldn't actually work together. So I decided to have them as a separate body of work and called it The End of the Affair. So it's a series of three volcanoes. This is Vesuvio, then I had Vulcano and also Stromboli in the different images. So they're all online and for anybody to see.
Well, let's jump ahead to the work with Floss, and we're going to start with the string lights, which I think many people will have seen, but not like this. So this is an amazing installation that you did at the with the artist Goshka Makuga, and here we see the potential of the lighting system really extended into what can only be called installation art, really. So could you talk a little bit maybe about this project, but also about the incredible productive relationship that you've had with Floss over the years, which is really one of the great partnerships between any designer and a brand?
Sure. This was my debut collection with Floss. I mean, it was this the start of our collaboration. This is how what I presented to the owner of Floss at the time, Piero Gandini. It was a book about the string lights. It was before we started working, and I said, this is something I'm working on, and he immediately said, this is going to be our project. And we went into this 2-year product development of this idea of this lamp with this super thin cable and an endless, string. And it was interesting because for me, this collection was beautiful in the sense that it was actually handing creativity back to the user, to the buyer. The idea that you're given a pencil and a blank sheet of paper and you're asked to draw. And in this particular case, you're drawing in 3 dimensions. And it's interesting because the image that came so many years later, it's actually an interpretation of a Schlemmer drawing. And it was an exhibition about the Bauhaus of Goshka Makuga. So she wanted to recreate this drawing, but in 3 dimensions, using the lights to highlight these furniture pieces, these Bauhaus pieces. And it's interesting because I liked also the idea of how you can use the cord to divide space and create architecture within a space, within a given space. And it was quite an important collection for me with floss. Very, very difficult to understand, of course, commercially or even appreciate in a wider audience, because the one that became a big hit was actually the IC collection, which everybody came to know me for, but definitely not this one. But for me, this is a much stronger, more powerful, because it touches so many different aspects of what light can actually be on that level.
And it's really two different ways of defining space brought together in this very powerful way. Can you say a little bit more here? We're just looking at the arrangements collection for floss. And
the arrangement is probably the second phase of that exploration of creativity. But in this case, you're not giving the audience just a blank sheet of paper and a pencil, because how do you make the first mark is always the big challenge, and everybody's scared to make that mark on the piece of paper. And hence, that's what actually scares people with the street lights. And it did, because experience proved that. But in this, arrangements is the fact that you can actually choose from different elements and create your own chandelier. Yeah. Like a vertical illuminated chain of many different geometric kind of shapes that you can link as a vertical change. In this particular scenario, you see a linear arrangement of these vertical chains in forming a screen, so which was part of an installation at the Floss showroom in showing a very, very different way of viewing the product, because this is not normally what you would expect from the product. But the idea of creating also architecture with it, not just simply a light fixture. So I'm very fascinated with what you can do with lighting in defining space.
And the same idea of modularity is also relevant to the coordinates collection. We see two expressions of that here.
Absolutely. I mean, this particular collection was developed as a commission by Issei Wainfield, the architect, the Brazilian architect, and redesigning, let's say, the relocation of the Four Seasons restaurant, the historical Four Seasons restaurant, which sadly, when it opened, it only lasted for a year. So nobody actually got to see this. But I partnered with Floss in the development of this particular system. We decided to develop it even further in creating this, again, flexible idea of combining these different modules, as well as having singular chandeliers and working on the horizontal and vertical kind of configuration. And as you can obviously see, that is also directly related to architecture, and even its name itself, the fact that you have all this vectors, the X, the Z, and the Y axis for defining this collection.
So now, Michael, I'm actually going to speed up quite a bit and just take quite a few images of your work with other brands, other companies. And really, this is an attempt to show some of the range of what you've done. So we might start with this beautiful beginning image, which is a collaboration with Herman Miller, and it's an installation beautifully entitled Double Dream of Spring, which features your spot stool, which was the product for Herman Miller.
And a giant version of the chandeliers, which were developed for that particular exhibition. So it was in the Herman Miller showroom in Milan.
Right. So can you talk about, here's the jack shelving system for B&B Italia. This is a tap.
Fantini.
Or Fantini, yes. A bag for Valextra. This wonderful chair that you did for Tonnet, which is such a kind of symphonic, linear reinterpretation of their famous bent wood and caned furniture. And then maybe the quintessence of your reductionism, the speaker for Bang & Olufsen, which is called Beosound Edge. Could you talk a little bit about this whole group of designs and what it's like to work with brands and how you think of your job? You know, what is it that you're trying to bring to the brand, and how do you hold on to yourself? Or maybe they're looking to you to be yourself. But how do you negotiate the identity of the brand as opposed to the identity of Michael Anastassiades?
Well, it's interesting because working all these years with Floss and developing lighting, and then suddenly the first furniture brand to invite me to try, you know, what I could do with furniture was Herman Miller, and that was the Double Dream of Spring. It was a fascinating invitation in the sense of developing something on a mass manufacturing kind of scale. The spot stool was an interesting item. I liked the fact that it was actually, the brief was a small piece of furniture. And I love stools. I love stools because of their ambiguity, because they are not really defined as seats, but also as tables or as abstract surfaces that you can use for planters, that you can do anything with them. And I love that versatility of that object. But later on, it seemed that, you know, that things suddenly started to change, and a lot of other companies, you know, that specialize in different things started inviting me to do things. I mean, of course, B&B with Jack, but later on Valextra and Fantini in terms, this is actually About Water, which is a joint company between Fantini and Boffy. So it's a special kind of collection of taps. And then later on, of course, Valextra, and then finally Bang & Olufsen. I love the idea, yes, Tonnet, of course, but more in the traditional sense of exploring bent wood furniture. But the way that I approach is exactly the same, Glenn. I never really differentiate. I mean, of course, it's a challenge. You have to kind of immerse yourself in learning so much about what it is that you're about to design. You know, in this particular case with Bang & Olufsen, you know, we spend endless hours really understanding their approach to sound, their sensibility to design, really understanding the traditional sort of their culture and their history as to everybody knows all these iconic pieces from Bang & Olufsen from the 70s and 80s. But somehow for me, it was an attempt to revisit that history in a strong way. Hence the choice of materials that you see here, you know, the reflective aluminum surface, and just simply this kind of ambiguous coin on its edge, which becomes a speaker. And trying to include this gesture in the operation of the speaker, because by simply rolling the speaker forward, you increase the volume, and rolling it backwards, you decrease the volume. So it has an interesting thing. So, and I know that everybody is, of course, aware that you can control all these things from your mobile phone, but it's nice for that gesture to exist. You know, at that moment when you actually tap it, if your phone rings, you can tap it and then you switch it off, or you pause it. So there is the way that you interact with technological products, and also with objects that you live with. I mean, really negotiating between history, tradition, technology, and really understanding where you would like to position things. And this is also interesting. I mean, even with Valextra being or considered a fashion brand, but it's not really a fashion brand. It's so strongly associated with craftsmanship and of course architecture. They work a lot with design and a lot with architecture in how they convey their image. But it is very much about, you know, how things and how beautifully things are put together. But to create a contemporary version of their history, I thought was quite a challenging thing to do. And looking at also at the handle, I mean, if you look at this elaborate strap, the fact that you had to have the short strap living together with the long strap. So what do you do with something that you suddenly casually throw on the sofa or an armchair? Then suddenly this strap has this embedded sort of magnets. So every time you position it, the strap kind of sticks itself in this interesting kind of controlled, spontaneous way. So, you know, it almost looks accidental, but it's not. It's all pre-planned.
It's looking at these designs, which you might say are the most commercial aspect of what you do. I'm also reminded of the stones with which we began, and you know, the line that you draw on the table with the stones, maybe relating to the bag strap or to the Tane chair, or this in some ways is like a technological version of this very simple primary object that's been with you for so many years. It's also just interesting to think about, let's say, Bang & Olufsen's relationship to stone as being like the craftsmanship of many of the companies you work with. I just have a few other examples here. For Lobmeyer, the flint glass, work for Prefercott, the great crystal company, and then this interesting pair of projects that you did with Karl Albach, the famous artisanal producer, in conjunction with Sigmar in London. So this is a salt and pepper called Italic, and then a coffee mill. And then finally this lamp for Svensk 10. So again, it's sort of what we talked about earlier about going in deep to the expertise and the identity of these various workshops that you're working with, while also bringing a lot of yourself to them.
Yeah. Working with historical brands for me was a very, very attractive element. I mean, the idea of really tapping into expertise and the tradition, the craftsmanship, and the knowledge that these companies can share with you was actually fundamental. And then bringing something that you can start a dialogue which is more relevant to today. This particular piece with Lobmeyer, for example, what's fascinating, you know, it references, of course, the Loos whiskey glass, which is, you know, the one with the cross hatch at the bottom of the thick kind of glass, but, you know, somehow capturing the light or accents of the light, and, you know, in the way that you put your whiskey, in the way that you drink, you experience also the roughness below the glass itself. I mean, talking about the loss, and suddenly in this particular one, you know, the base of it is hammered, is chipped. You know, and every single glass is different. Of course, it's later on hand sort of polished so that, you know, you can't cut yourself. But this idea of this danger or this tactility of this object is there. And it's interesting because it brings it into a very contemporary context. And I love that link with these companies. In the case of Karl Albach as well, such a beautiful sort of tradition, and, you know, so many generations of Karl Albachs, all of them architects, and even the current Karl Albach, an amazingly eccentric and interesting man that is totally passionate about, you know, extending, you know, the legend of his sort of grandfather's kind of pieces, but at the same time very eager to share his expertise and knowledge. So the idea of a partnership, because I call this a partnership, is not purely my own design. It was I came up with the idea, and Karl engineered it himself, and it was my idea about actually having the handle and the lever handle not being so long, because this is the way that you reduce the effort, but actually using a system of gears that reduce the amount of effort that you need in order to grind the coffee. So it's a beautiful, heavy engineered kind of piece. And I was actually using it for 2 years every day, grinding my own coffee. So it's labor of love, of course, but, you know, it's nice to have the time for objects like that in our everyday lives.
Just slowing down and creating that moment, right? We just finished with 2 last projects that are also produce that kind of an effect. So this is, again, back at the V&A, this is in the courtyard. And this is a sensor operated water fountain, drinking fountain called Fleet. And I had noticed that you said that when you bend down to drink from it, it also actually functions as a mirror. And so it creates this kind of moment of self-presence for you. But again, we see the column as referenced too.
Well, it's fascinating because for me, the ritual of drinking water, I mean, it's almost like a sacred moment.
Yes.
And it's interesting to choose the idea of bronze, of giving it value, and the idea of a polished bronze surface over which, when you bend over, you see, and suddenly first you see or all these incredible reflections, not just of yourself, but of other objects around you being reflected, but at the same time, how also the light reflects and illuminates your face. And it's incredible how you interact with this object, and giving it such preciousness to a simple gesture of simply reintroducing drinking fountains into the city, which seem to be have disappeared from the streets of London. Maybe in other cities around Europe, and probably in the US you might have more of them, but there are not that many. There were not that many left when we did this project.
Yeah, it's such a note of elevation to have in a public space, isn't it? Yeah. And sociality as well, generosity. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we have an installation from LDF, the London Design Festival, and this was in Mint Street, and it's consists of Portuguese marble that has been shown to advantage on its edge. So we see here a detail of the surface on the right, and then just a overall shot, and then this gorgeous shot, which we can end with. Very atmospheric and showing what a material can do when just simply presented as itself.
But because this was actually rejected marble, and it's about finding a second life for that marble. It's marble slabs that have been sitting in marble yards, and various marble yards in Portugal, and nobody wanted to buy them. So effectively, they had absolutely no value. They were already cut as tiles to be used, to be bought and used as tiles, but nobody wanted them because they were second rate. So what I tried to intervene in the most minimal way. So all I simply did is cut the tile in half and laid it on its edge, because you needed the depth in order to lay a strip, because otherwise, if it was just a thin part of it, it would pop out and eventually it will fall apart. So it's great that even 2 years later, it's aged well and it's very beautiful, because by simply walking on it, because we never really polished the edge, but the edges started getting polished by wear, which is really beautiful. And of course, with the rain and abrasion, just simply, and it's nice that suddenly this carpet that is laid has its life of its own.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end it on. I'm afraid that I've occupied all of our time. We don't really have our traditional Q&A time, but as Lucy just mentioned to me, I've already asked you a lot of questions. We've had a lot of enthusiastic support in the chat box of people admiring the work. I will just ask you one last question, which is, what do you have coming up? What's next in the world of Michael Anastassiades?
Exciting. I mean, of course, also post or recovery time after COVID, but I think it's interesting times. I mean, of course, we haven't stopped our ideas developing in the studio, getting ready probably for Salone next year. In terms of my own brand of lighting, we're doing quite extensive new product development, which we're planning to launch there. An exciting moment is also an exhibition at the ICA in Milan. It's an incredible institution, fairly recent. It's actually a little bit, it's right next to the Prada Foundation, and that's an interesting show because they've never done a design show as such. And it's a great invitation to do so. hopefully the original plan that it was going to be in April and opened during the Salone period, but it might get delayed a little bit. We haven't confirmed the dates yet, the new dates yet. So lots of exciting things. As long as I get the new challenge and put on the table, I'm quite excited. So.
Well, I don't think they're going to stop coming your way anytime soon. Again, I hope you can see the chat box. Everyone is sending their well wishes and congratulations. And I'll just read out one thing, which is that Orla Dunstan has said, so true, the humanity and creativity that is infused in every design is very inspiring. And I can't think of a better way to sum it all up. The way that you look back into the deep past thousands of years ago, and yet are also looking ahead through these designs and in such a simple, understated, and perfectly resolved way. It's truly inspiring and shows us what design can do, frankly. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Michael.
Great to chat with you.
And just to let folks know, we are going to have a